Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. So Donald Trump has named his vice presidential running mate, and it is J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio and author of best-selling memoir Hillbilly Elegy. This has already panicked pretty much everybody. Democrats highlight his opposition to abortion, controversial stance on Ukraine, and comments about the supposedly stolen 2020 election to make him out to be a grave danger. Meanwhile, the establishment voices in the Republican Party seem to be barely less anxious. This episode, we are going to try to see past the panic and understand, as best we can, the worldview, the philosophy of J.D. Vance and the so-called New Right movement that he is such a prominent voice in. To help us do that, I am delighted that we are joined by Oren Cass. Oren himself is seen as a fellow leader of the same wing of the party, contributing editor of American Affairs, president of American Compass, which itself is a major institution of that movement. Both of those are closely involved with Senator Vance. In fact, this is what yesterday's Washington Post had to say about their relationship. Alarm over Vance's connection to Oren Cass's American Compass group and support for FTC chairwoman Lena Khan has spread among top business executives and donors, said one senior business figure who spoke on the condition of anonymity to share candid opinions. Well, Oren, there you go. You are causing panic among senior business officials who speak on the condition of anonymity. Where do we begin? I mean, what's your first reaction as to the disquiet that J.D. Vance's nomination seems to have caused?
Well, I think it's justified in a sense, because in ideological terms, I think this represents really the completion of this transformation that the conservative movement and the Republican Party has been undergoing. I mean, the distance from Mike Pence to J.D. Vance is in a sense the distance from the old right, the party that was just tax cuts, free trade, maybe busted some unions on the side, to the party that we are seeing, to the conservative movement that is in focus going forward, that really does have a working class base, that is really focused on the interests of workers, families, communities, and that I think, frankly, has the potential to actually build a durable governing majority and address some of America's problems.
Let's start, if we could, with the figure of J.D. himself. I know you're close and you know him well. Obviously, he's had an unusual story, unusual journey to becoming a senior politician. He had a very difficult childhood in Ohio. His mom was a heroin addict. He wrote about his difficult upbringing in Hillbilly Elegy. And he then joined the military. He had a period in Silicon Valley where he was an investor there, and then seems to have kind of rejected that and embraced, again, in quite a quick evolution from 2016, where I'm sure the Democrats will be using all of those quotes throughout the campaign. He was violently opposed or strongly opposed to Donald Trump. He now is his running mate. How do you observe that journey, having sort of seen it close up?
Well, I think one reason there's so much enthusiasm for JD, especially among, younger conservatives, this next generation, is that that path that you've just described is one that's so familiar to so many of us. I started my career in business consulting. There was an understanding that is what one goes and does after one gets an elite education, whether you go to Silicon Valley, whether you go to Wall Street, et cetera. And increasingly what we see is a generation of folks who went into that world, learned about it, and really saw its dysfunction, recognized both problems within industries like finance, and then also recognized the broader problems in the country at large, that, we were all taught, well, whoever goes and sort of does something that makes a lot of money, by default, that's good for everybody else as well. And it turns out that's not the case. And I think one of the really interesting things about JD's background is that, Hillbilly Elegy sort of became this story about Trump somehow. But of course, it wasn't about Trump, right? It came out before Trump, which means he was writing it well before Trump. And it's really, I think, a product of this fascinating period in America between 2012 and 2016. And I'm always so cognizant of this because I, of course, worked for Mitt Romney in 2012. And then saw what happened between there and the Republican Party by the end of 2016. And it's really important to recognize that is the period when I think so many people, certainly in the political world, but also in the academic and scholarly world, in the media, realized that something was wrong in America. I mean, all of the focus on the opioid epidemic, the deaths of despair, all of that was after 2012. All of the focus on what China had done, the China shock, all of that was in this period as well. And so Hillbilly Elegy and what JD was doing in a sense, it was really a quite prescient, important statement about something that was very wrong in the country that, until folks like him started talking about it, had not been realized. And I think that provides the starting point for what he's done since.
So in a way, you also had a similar kind of conversion then. I mean, it's big distance from Mitt Romney to where you are as well. Do you feel...
Yeah.
So you also kind of, you were inside a more corporate establishment kind of Republican thinking, and you feel you've turned your back on it in a similar way to how JD has.
Yeah, my own experience was I sort of, and I guess as with him, I didn't come up through the sort of standard channels that one is supposed to be a conservative in good standing. I didn't do all the summer fellowships sponsored by the various think tanks and Wall Street billionaires. I didn't sort of, walk around with my copies of Hayek and Friedman or whatever else. I really sort of arrived in the Romney campaign while I was still in law school and thought I knew what we were supposed to believe as conservatives, and discovered that what the Republican Party and its experts thought we had to say was just very different from that. And, for me, the China issue was especially formative because it was actually then Governor Romney who, said himself, we need to have something to say about China. The standard free trade with China good answer just is obviously wrong. And I got sent off to figure out what was going on with it. And what I found was an establishment on the right of center that simply was not interested in the question, couldn't conceive that there would be anything wrong with free trade with China or that anybody was suffering as a result. And that for me was, really made me recognize, well, gosh, I wonder what else we're getting wrong.
So you've mentioned free trade there. Let's just take that as our first sort of genuine topic. One thinks of Republicans as being free traders traditionally. Are you and JD not free traders? Or do you think he's a free trader with caveats? Or he's supposedly in favor of tariffs, which Donald Trump has also talked about. So that's clearly not a free trade position, but what is the reality of a J.D. Vance trade policy?
The Republican Party was not the party of free trade for almost its entire history. The Republican Party was the tariff party, going all the way back to Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt. Someone sent me a wonderful quote from Eisenhower's memoir, where even Eisenhower is talking very hesitantly about the idea of opening up more trade, but only as long as we are still protecting domestic industry. And of course, even Reagan was a protectionist. The Cato Institute called Reagan the worst protectionist since Herbert Hoover. He took all sorts of action, most notably forcing the Japanese automakers to come and make their cars in the U.S. And so what we think of as this kind of free trade consensus in the Republican Party is this very strange, anachronistic, post-Cold War ideology that it's certainly not conservative and also certainly isn't good economics. It doesn't work. I think, what I would say and what a lot of folks on the new right would say is that trade is wonderful if it's actually trade. If we are making something and people in another country are making something and we trade one for the other, that can be great. That can make everybody better off. But that's not what we have. And especially with respect to China, what we have is a relationship where they distort their market wildly. They block entry to it. They subsidize it. And so they make and sell enormous amounts of stuff to us, but not in exchange for stuff that we make and sell to them. What they take back is assets. What they take back is ownership of our companies, corporate debt, treasury debt, basically pieces of paper saying, we owe you or you own us. And that's not a trade anyone should be in favor of.
Well, should we speculate? If Donald Trump and Senator Vance do win, how might trade policy change? Do you think it would be high tariffs? Do you think would there be a move against globalization more generally, a more protectionist kind of world?
Yes, very much so. And I think it comes down to two elements. One is a focus on balanced trade, which is this idea that trade is good if we are actually trading things for things, but also just the idea that making things matters. For a long time, as part of this so-called free trade consensus, there was an attitude that it didn't matter what you make or whether you make anything. In fact, if you can get someone else to make the stuff for you, all the better. And I think what Americans generally have realized, the Biden administration also for the most part, is that in fact, it's critically important to have a strong industrial base. It's important for national security. It's important for growth and innovation. It's important for jobs, for families and communities. And so I think, this is where policy like tariffs comes into play. The premise of a tariff is to say, actually, we do care where things are made, and we are going to put our finger on the scale for things made here in America, and we're going to make it more attractive to make more things in America. And, in a sense, the tariff is the stick. The tariff is making it unattractive to buy things from abroad. Along with that, I think the other key theme you see is a focus on industrial policy. The idea that you also, as American policymakers, want to support productive investment in actually making things in America. And, this is a point that JD has made in a number of contexts. He specifically contrasts from his experience, watching what do people get paid to create addictive algorithms at Facebook versus what do people get paid to actually do something productive in the economy. And we have markets in the US today where the best ways to make a lot of money are develop addictive social media apps, trade piles of assets in circles on Wall Street, speculate in cryptocurrency. So that's what the capital flows to. That's what the talent flows to. And saying, actually, we have the right to notice that and say it's not good and create policy that pushes investment, pushes effort back toward actually building valuable things that create good jobs. That's a role for public policy.
I mean, you say building valuable things. Facebook is one of the largest companies in the world. A lot of those technology companies have been leading the American economy for the past few years. So they might well say at this point, that is value. What is it that you want to see at the top of the S&P 500? Is it a kind of corn farming company, or what is the new future going to look like?
Well, I think you'd want to see a diversified economy, certainly, but it confuses matters even to talk about Facebook as the value of the company as something valuable that we've made, right? You're describing a financial asset. It is a piece of paper that entitles its holder to the future profits generated by Facebook. There's no question that the U.S. has done a very good job generating a lot of pieces of paper that a lot of people think are very valuable. But you certainly can't eat paper. You can't even drive it around. And it doesn't create a lot of jobs for anybody either. And so what we're talking about is the distinction between the financial markets, where you have assets that seem to forever go up in value, even though that doesn't actually translate to the prosperity of the typical family in any way, versus actual productive activity in the real economy, creating opportunities for people to do things with their talents and effort that provide things of value to other people. And that's supposed to be the actual point of capitalism.
And technology seems to be particularly in J.D. Vance's sights. Obviously, he has experience of it, having been a venture capital investor, and he's pretty much turned his back on it. He seems to think it's one of the great evils of modern society. He talks a lot about addictive algorithms that you just mentioned. What does he want to do to the technology companies? Is he going to try and break them up? Is he going to try and impose new restrictions on them? What might happen?
Well, I don't think there's anything inherently evil about technology. I think there are two real problems with what we see in the technology sector today. One is that the business model of the sector is to try to develop a monopoly in some market that is going to generate massive rents and therefore generate these huge valuations that have no correlation to what one is actually doing in the real economy. And so when you think about a Google or a Facebook, what you have there in effect is something that everybody is chasing. Everybody wants to be the next Google or Facebook, but the profits that they generate aren't actually from technology per se. They're technically media companies that have captured advertising markets. And among other things, they are not especially innovative at this point. I mean, Google's track record in innovation has been a disaster. And so, one issue is to look at these kinds of companies and that model of investment and development and say, that's not actually what we should be rewarding. And in fact, we do need antitrust enforcement. We need competition policy that whether you regulate these things or break them up actually makes clear we're not going to just have you collecting hundreds of billions of dollars in profits because you're the only place to advertise. That's not that's not pro innovation or pro growth or pro anything really, except I guess pro stock market valuation.
But so if you're sitting in one of those companies or you're heavily invested in one of them now, you would be right to be anxious about a Vice President Vance or a President Trump, because from what you're saying, they'll be in the sights of an incoming administration. Is that fair?
I think that's absolutely right. I think generally speaking, and again, this is how it should be. If you are a rent seeker in the capitalist economy, if your model of generating profit is to monopolize a market and make profit by virtue of avoiding competition, then you should be worried about what the government is going to do. That is exactly the role for public policy in a healthy market economy. And the problem we've had in recent decades, and especially on the right of center, but frankly to a great extent on the left of center in the sort of Clinton-Obama model, is to just disavow that and just say, well, look, if Google and Facebook are making tons of money and the product is free for consumers, and the stock values keep going up, then who's to complain? This all looks great. And I think a huge piece of the economic thinking on the new right that undergirds all of these issues, whether talking about trade or technology or labor, the core point is to recognize that capitalism isn't about generating high profits. In fact, Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, the rate of profit is highest in those nations that are going most quickly to ruin. High, reliable profits that aren't subject to competition is a huge red warning sign that your market is not working well.
Sitting here in London, or in Europe generally, where we look with such envy at the American economic performance of the last few years, where even the newly incoming Labour government talks about growth as its highest priority. Why can't we be more like the US with its incredible innovative tech sector? It would be a very remarkable thing if an incoming Republican administration starts sort of taking the axe to the egg from the golden goose, or whatever the expression is, of the American economy. It would be most remarkable. Do you think that would actually happen?
I think it's a misunderstanding to think about these particularly these big tech companies as sort of the golden goose of the American economy. They certainly are the golden goose of the stock market, right? And that's one of the fascinating things about, if you look at the S&P 500 in recent years, what share of that appreciation is just those few companies, Google, Amazon, Nvidia, Tesla, et cetera. And you take those out and the entire rest of the economy has really not been doing much of anything in the way of growth. And so I think to a significant extent, these sort of most high profile valuation driving businesses, they really mask the underlying problem, which is that for the overwhelming majority of the economy, which includes most workers, most regions, they're not benefiting from that. And that ultimately is the problem. And that is the problem with our model. I like to make fun of the idea of sort of, quote, growing the pie, right? Because the idea was always, well, look, as long as we get growth, as long as we grow the pie, then there's more pie for everybody. Maybe we'll have to redistribute the pie somehow to everybody, who can't bake their own pie, but that's fine. We'll all have lots of pie. And that model of thinking just looks so broadly at the aggregate. It doesn't actually ask what is happening to the typical worker, to the region that is being left behind. And it sort of makes the mistake of taking the average, of saying, well, the average wealth of Bill Gates and 1,000 very poor people is quite good. And I think a huge piece of what's been going on in the rethinking of economics is to realize that that's not what a healthy economy looks like, that a healthy economy is measured by what's going on with the typical worker, with the typical family. And Google's stock price has nothing to do with that.
So the challenge to you, and I suspect to JD, will have to be, there was similar talk last time Donald Trump looked like he was about to win in 2016. And I remember on the morning of his surprise victory, initially stocks dipped, and then already by later that morning, there was a huge surge as the markets bet that actually, in real life, President Trump would want to juice the stock market. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. It was 4 years of great stock market growth. Don't you think the same thing would happen again now?
I think there's certainly an element of that. Trump himself and certainly the advisors around him are an eclectic mix of ideological views, of economic philosophies. And, one thing that you saw certainly happen with Trump is that he came in and there were no plans on the shelf except for the old plans. He was sort of the dog that caught the car. And when you looked down Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to the Capitol, who was sitting there in Congress? It was Paul Ryan with a plan for a big tax cut and to repeal Obamacare. And that's what the legislative agenda became. 8 years later, it's a very different context, partly in just the plans on the shelf perspective. This is a tremendous amount of what an organization like American Compass has been focused on is both developing the talent and the ideas that actually accompany the talk, in a sense. But as importantly, I think if you think about who is in Congress, up until yesterday, one would have said J.D. Vance is a key person there. But he and his team have developed an enormous set of ideas around this. You also have Senator Rubio, who obviously was also one of the finalists for the nomination, Senator Hawley, Senator Cotton. Those are the folks who actually have the momentum and drive the thinking on policy.
So it's organizations like yours, basically, Oren, that have been working for the last few years, and it's sometimes called sort of intellectual Trumpism, trying to build an actual policy platform or a kind of intellectual framing ideology to go behind Donald Trump. It sounded when he lost that you had sort of given up on Donald Trump and he wasn't going to be your standard bearer, and the project of American Compass and everything you were working on was to see how a new leader might do better. Have you now settled that Donald Trump can be the standard bearer for your kind of thinking? Do you think you fully re-educated him, captured him?
No, I don't think so. I have optimism, particularly if you look, he had a choice between a Vance-like figure or a Doug Burgum-like figure for his ticket, and he made a quite notable choice. And so I think that certainly speaks to what he might be thinking. It also, just as a practical matter, means that Vance gets to bring a team to the White House that thinks the way that he does, that will have an enormous influence on the direction that policy goes. But I'm sure there are plenty of things that Trump will do that will not be in line with this necessarily. He has plenty of priorities that don't fit neatly in a consistent ideological box. And that has been the reality since he came onto the scene. But equally, the reality is the long-term direction of the right of center, the conservative movement, and the Republican Party. And that's where it has always, to some extent, I think, been a question of what comes after Trump. We know what came before Trump. There's Trump, which, I always say there is no Trumpism. There is just Trump. And then there's the question of what will come after Trump. And the long-term health of the conservative movement, ultimately of the United States, I think, comes down to the question of what follows Trump, of making sure we don't just fall back to what was there before.
Let's do a bit more of a tour of the topic areas that get controversial with Senator Vance. So another one which here in Europe people are particularly fretful about is his position on Ukraine, NATO. He's one of the most vocally isolationist, I would say, or people who are least supportive of the Western-led campaign, the Ukrainian self-defense campaign. He led the opposition to the funding of it in Congress. What's your version of that? How should Europeans understand that?
I don't think he's ever called for the U.S. withdrawing from the world. I think certainly with respect to NATO, he's made the quite important point that NATO is supposed to be an alliance with clearly delineated responsibilities and commitments from all the parties. And a large number of those parties have simply chosen for a very long time not to adhere to those commitments and free ride on the United States. And that is a bizarre state of affairs that the United States should never have tolerated and frankly, among other things, cannot afford to tolerate going forward. And so that's something that certainly Trump has placed great focus on, and I think Vance would as well. And then likewise with respect to Ukraine in particular, what was very impressive about his leadership on this issue in the Senate is that it wasn't something that he sort of demagogued. And that's where, again, I think the kind of isolationist language is inappropriate. He asked a very important question, which is, what is the plan here? What is the end game? What is the strategy? And what is this proposed massive amount of spending going to accomplish toward it? And no one could answer the question.
Well, he also said, and I quote, "To tell you the truth, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine," in a podcast with Steve Bannon, and that certainly is going to be played over the next couple of months. Maybe that's not isolationist, maybe it is, but it doesn't suggest that he's deeply engaged in the future of that country.
His perspective on the U.S. foreign policy, whether it's with Ukraine or certainly with respect to Asia, where I think he would argue we need to be much more focused on China, isn't an isolationist one. It's one that asks the U.S. to prioritize, understand where its most important strategic interests are, and then make sure that we are equipped to address those.
So we've had a message to technology companies and markets: be afraid. What about message to Europe? Yeah, things are going to get real if Trump wins, because whether or not support for NATO actually sort of changes materially, there will definitely be a strong pressure for Europe to defend itself, at the very least.
Well, that's right. And I wouldn't characterize that as be afraid, of course. I would characterize that as maybe get serious.
China, very quickly, you mentioned that more attention needs to be spent on China. Does that mean that people like J.D. Vance and members of that movement basically want to divert resources from places like Ukraine to China, and that they are gearing up to a potential conflict over Taiwan?
The U.S. does not have the resources to sort of be the world's policeman, to sort of exert the sort of hegemonic influence that we became accustomed to after the Cold War, which means we actually have to go through the exercise of prioritizing. And if we try to figure out what the most serious threat to U.S. interests is, it quite clearly is the prospect of China asserting hegemony over Asia, which is increasingly the center of the world economy and where a lot of the U.S.'s most important allies are. And so our first question, in essence, has to be, what is our strategy vis-a-vis China? We are not going to dominate them, but we do need to find some arrangement with them and maintain a stable balance of power that protects our interests.
With regard to labor policy, minimum wage, employment rights, is this also something that you'd imagine a Vance-Trump White House to be making big changes on?
I think it's hard to say, because it's a great example of one of these issues where, Trump himself has not tended to show a lot of interest. Although quite strikingly, he had Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters Union, closing out the first night of the Republican National Convention. And so I think it is hard to predict where exactly that the various forces from all directions will pan out within the administration. But I think it's very notable when you think about what's going on the new right with folks like JD, work that American Compass does. It's very notable to see the focus that you didn't used to have within the Republican Party on worker power. And the idea that worker power is good, that organized labor is an important way to help support and provide worker power. Of course, as you mentioned, minimum wage is another one. You see a lot more support for raising the minimum wage. Immigration enforcement is another one. But all of these come down to this idea that, whereas the old right view was cheap labor is good because cheap labor is good for business, so it must be good, and it leads to cheaper stuff and higher profits. That's not really the view anymore. The recognition now is that people are not just consumers, they are also workers. And in many ways, they are first and foremost workers, and that a successful economic policy has to be one in which outcomes are good for workers. And you're only going to get that if they actually have some power to assert their interests. And so I think that is something that historically, because it's been something Democrats spend more time talking about, the term labor policy has come to mean, well, are you for or against some particular priority of the labor unions? But I think increasingly we'll see that's not how people think about it, that labor policy is going to come down to, are you for things that are actually going to strengthen worker power? And unlike in the past, that's something a lot of Republicans are going to be focused on.
So if you are a libertarian or an establishment Republican listening to this, it's quite a shopping list that they could legitimately be very worried about. Are you hoping that the reverse is now true, that people who consider themselves on the left become less worried? People who might have voted Democrat previously might become more attracted to this ticket if they start talking about labor rights and the rest of it?
A lot of people speak about so-called realignment in American politics, which is clearly going on. There was a time when you thought of the Democratic Party as the labor working class party, and then you had the so-called country club Republicans. It's very hard to go into a country club and find a lot of Republicans these days, certainly in many parts of the country. The more highly educated, high-income professionals, managerial class, etc., have increasingly become aligned with the Democratic Party. And conversely, you see a lot more working-class Americans, folks without college degrees, across races, across religions, moving into the Republican Party. And that is sort of an interesting trade. The reality is there's a lot more people in the latter group. If for every libertarian you lose, there are 10 workers out there who have probably always been more socially conservative and now hear a right of center that's speaking to their economic concerns as well. I really do think that's the pathway to a durable governing majority in the country.
So your work is mainly focused on the kind of economic aspects of the new right, but what should people understand about the Christian influences in much of that thinking? Abortion is obviously a particular flashpoint in terms of policy. Christian nationalism is sometimes bandied about as a phrase. Certainly national conservatism, which J.D. Vance is often seen as part of. He speaks at their conferences. How would you position the Christian influence on people like J.D. Vance? And how, in particular, should we understand the combination of that with Donald Trump, who, to most people's mind, doesn't strike them as a particularly Christian kind of guy?
I think it's one of the interesting sort of debates going on even within the new right? It's like you already have within conservatism, you have this fight between the sort of legacy establishment, kind of free market fundamentalist crowd and this kind of new right thinking that we've been talking about here. Then even within the new right, you have a number of debates, and this is one of them. To what extent is it both politically wise and substantively correct to try to ground this kind of thinking in overtly religious language and themes, versus to what extent does it make more sense to conceptualize it as a fundamentally sort of secular phenomenon, certainly compatible with religious commitments and but not sort of requiring them or centered on them. I've said for myself, I don't care for the Christian nationalism framing. I think it both misunderstands politically what will build a successful coalition, and it misunderstands substantively what the right argument is for these kinds of policies.
Do you think in terms of JD that he also comes down to that kind of conclusion? I mean, obviously he converted to Catholicism relatively recently. I think it was 2019. He is a religious person. He has spoken very strongly against abortion in all circumstances, including incest and rape. I believe he has slightly moderated his position in recent years. He now is not in favor of a ban. He thinks it's a matter for the states and is content with that. Still, to many secular people, it will sound maybe even frighteningly religious. Do you think the reality of J.D. Vance in office would be religion and the more overtly Christian aspects get more put to one side?
Catholic social teaching has played an increasing role in a lot of this thinking. And, it's one thing that I'm always very interested in is looking at, for instance, how popes in various encyclicals have talked about labor rights. There's this interesting overlap where historically under so-called fusionism, the Reagan coalition, where you had the free market libertarians, the social conservatives, and the Cold War hawks all in a coalition together, it was somehow assumed that the social conservatism and the so-called religious right was naturally aligned with the free market libertarians in their thinking. But that's not really true. It was a marriage of convenience at best. And I think one thing that we're seeing now is that, social conservatives, those with deep religious commitments and who bring that religion to their thinking about public policy issues, don't care for the libertarianism at all. And the much greater focus on, we haven't spoken much all about family policy, but directly supporting working families, supporting workers, really favoring labor over capital. All of that is a much more coherent economic agenda to attach to social conservatism. And I think that is what you are likely to see on the right of center in the future.
In terms of Donald Trump himself, we're trying to make sense of all these different moving parts pulling in different directions. What you and your colleagues have done, building up this new right, this kind of intellectual background for a Trump 2, do you feel that he is on board with that? Do you feel that Trump 2 will be very different from Trump 1 in the ways that we've been talking about today?
I think it'll be different in some ways and not so different in other ways. I think personnel will be incredibly important. We will see, if he were to win election, who he puts into which cabinet posts and so forth. Obviously, that's a way where making this pick for vice president is so significant. But it will be a mixed bag. Trade certainly seems to be an issue where he's particularly committed, as he was in his first term. Immigration obviously seems a priority. I suspect family policy will be a significant priority. I suspect competition and antitrust policy will be pretty significant. What he does on labor, what he does on taxes and so forth, I think to some extent remains to be seen.
Oren, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
That was Oren Cass, one of the big brains of the so-called New Right movement in American politics, a close colleague and fellow traveller with J.D. Vance, the potential next vice president if Donald Trump is elected. We've spoken to JD's team about an interview, and I hope he will talk to us. But in the meantime, I thought Oren gave us a fascinating overview of the kind of thinking J.D. Vance will bring into a Trump administration. And it's quite unlike the Republican Party as we've known it, at least for the past years. Skeptical about stock markets, planning to make life difficult for big tech companies, keen on tariffs, keen on minimum wages, labor unions, none of it sounds remotely like Trump 1 either. But if Oren Cass and his group of thinkers get their way, and certainly if Vance succeeds Trump in some years' time, what we've just heard could be the future of American policy. Thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd.